month, I started telling you about the importance of establishing a spiritual practice for yourself. And now it's time to look at our next part in this ongoing series of doing just that. So when I concluded last month, I basically finished up by saying you have access to a lot of spiritual power, a lot of the power of the cosmos, for want of a better word, without having to engage in magical potions or magical methods or anything like that. That spiritual power is within us, and access to spiritual power is within us. What we want to do is get our hands onto what does it take for ourselves to lead to some kind of spiritual growth without having to access outside information or outside tools. I mean, the question really is, where does knowledge come from? What would that outside information be? In modern times, we tend to think of ancient wisdom as something buried and lost in the past, only relevant to the past. Maybe it's quaint, but it's archaic, it's irrelevant. It's often seen as completely wrong. Teachings from the past are just dismissed because they are seen as completely wrong. We live in the age of information, where we're interested in learning new things and finding out new things. We seek out new ideas wherever we can. We even invent new ideas all the time. We go to workshops for that. We go to teachers for that. We're constantly looking and looking for one expert and one book after another. And books like The Secret, or books that purport to tell you your karma or some other important thing, I'm always amazed that these authors seem to have access to knowledge and information that none of us seem to know about. Many years ago, when I started getting more involved in traditional Vedic and Indian practices and bringing those techniques more into my own spiritual methods, a friend of mine commented that she was the kind of person who needs to find her own methods. She said, I need to chip my path through to. And I always had these visions of her on the side of a mountain, painstakingly chipping away with her pickaxe, forging dangerous paths and dangerous steps and falling off the mountain at any moment. And she said that's what works for her. And there are many people today who would say that, well, I've got to find my own way. I'll find many different things that work for me. And look, it's an admirable task. I mean, chipping away at a path through the mountain is not an easy task. And she would point out, and as many of you who've tried to forge your own way through the mountain will know, it's not easy. It takes many lifetimes to do that. And I always think, if you zoom out from that vision, there she is chipping away on the side of the mountain, and next to her is this great big highway that stretches thousands of years into the past and forges ahead into the future of human knowledge and human wisdom and human experience. That stuff that we so easily reject as archaic and no longer relevant, that offers the highway to spiritual knowledge. So I think that the best way to get to spiritual knowledge is through accessing wisdom from the past. And in the remainder of this ongoing series about spiritual paths and creating a spiritual practice for yourself that we'll have once a month here on Suskins World, we're going to look at different aspects of ancient wisdom that actually give us direct methodology to find a spiritual path of our own. But the fact remains, why do we pass on knowledge? Why do we write books? Why do we pass on our knowledge to future generations if everyone, especially in the 21st century, just kind of wants to start again on their own terms and says those people needed to do that, but now we've got a different life? So we tend to try and go it alone. And you know, there's not much that we can learn on our own. I mean, if you wanted to learn how to drive a car, you'd have to have someone who knows how to drive a car to show you. So, like I said to my friend, chipping away is one great task, but why always start at the beginning? If we've already learned how to do things, Why start from the beginning every time? If everyone started from the beginning all the time, we'd all forever be novices. We'd never get anywhere at all. Everyone would always be at the beginning of something, and we wouldn't benefit from shared experience. So it is important to draw on that wisdom from the past, because it adds many kilometers, lifetimes, to our own paths and gives us a head start. So I want to introduce one of the ancient techniques to use today, and it's one that we see in many traditional spiritual practices, including African spiritual practices. This technique is going to prepare you for a spiritual practice. It'll become part of your spiritual practice, but it's also an exercise to get you ready and to get you into the right frame and to appreciate what it's all about. An exercise in humility, because it is humility that really is required before we can make any progress along the spiritual path. Why is that? Because our ego is our greatest enemy. We seek comfort, we seek importance and relevance, we seek safety, and we seek integrity. We need to know that I'm okay and this is me and I'm doing it fine. And all of those things are fine themselves, but we have an ego, a strong sense of identity in order to fit that all together. And for the most part, that is very useful. We have that sense of identity because we need that sense of identity. So the first step to really growing spiritually is to learn to see beyond that ego. You can't demolish it completely, but you can learn to see beyond it. And if you're able to see beyond that ego, you're able to reach into broader, more eternal aspects of yourself. Call it the soul, but certainly beyond the ego. You can see it in traditional Eastern practices. We're told, chop wood, carry water is the way of the novice. And it is the task of fetching the wood and fetching the water done with delight and humility and not worrying about anything else, that frees the novice up from all the tasks of the world, that frees them from having goals, but which sounds great. I don't have to worry about important things. I can just go and fetch water from the river. But it's a difficult job. It's heavy. It's a slippery path to the river, and it starts attacking the ego. And that says, actually, I didn't go to university to carry water and chop wood. I didn't get all that experience and suffer and struggle in life to now be told to carry the water and chop the wood. And this is something we see with Sangoma trainees called twazas. A lot of it is about chopping wood and carrying water. It is those mundane tasks that remind us that we are no more important and relevant than the next person because those mundane tasks need to be done. That's why we need to get the ego out of the way, because as long as the ego is thinking like that, never letting go of that identity, spiritual progress will not be made. If we know ourselves to be these physical beings in the world struggling with life, money, and all the challenges of the world, we know that we're not that enlightened spiritual being. Well, then tell that to our egos. Tell our egos, well, if this is not the enlightened spiritual being, then surely the only solution is to let go of that identity or break down that identity. Because it may be great to have an identity as a university professor, a chartered accountant, a school teacher, a mother of children, and what would they do without you? All those many identities of our lives are important and real, but they're not important to our spiritual paths. So let's try and let go of that ego in order to get there. So here is an exercise to perform at least once for a full day, but hopefully you'll try it a few times before we get to January's show on taking your spiritual path even further. So essentially it is a day where we try and experience what it means to not have an identity with that ego, whatever your everyday life is. So the basic rule for the exercise is that all the daily activities, washing, eating, preparing that food, are performed with a deliberate, almost naive innocence. You start off by performing those tasks as if you were a child doing them for the first time. When you wake up in the morning and you're preparing your breakfast, or doing any of those things, preparing the children's breakfast, to try and imagine that you are doing that for the first time. No, you're just going to be attentive. It's the start of this exercise, focuses you into the present and helps you understand the importance of those things that you're doing. Pay attention to that task. From making the breakfast or to brushing your teeth, whatever it is, pay close attention as if you'd never done it before. And that helps you start getting aware of the present, because we do so many things automatically. And if you brush your teeth with awareness of what you're doing and try and imagine you're the person who's discovering toothbrushing, it completely changes your sense of the importance of what you're doing, and it makes you aware and paying attention in the present. And that's really the intention of the first part of the exercise, which is childlike innocence, or approaching everything as if done for the first time. The second part of your exercise is to change some of your daily habits that involve luxury. For sitting, sit on the floor. Sit on a mat on the floor. Don't sit straight on the floor, but sit on the floor, for example. Trainees often do that. Or avoid comfortable furniture if it's not possible for you to sit on the floor. For your bath, don't put any bath salts or oils or other things that you might be doing. Why not turn the heat of that bath right down? Take a cold shower or a cold bath. Don't use the hot water. Don't allow luxury to feed the ego's sense of I'm important. And remember that many people don't have any of that luxury at all. And also, don't distract yourself. No newspapers, no television, no internet for that whole day. But most importantly, not the news. So that means no Facebook, and it means no TV and no newspapers. But you probably have to turn off the whole internet to avoid any sense of what's going on. News and all that stuff makes us feel important, makes us feel part of something that's significant and important, and distracts us from ourselves and from our own paths. I mean, it's just these days it's enough of a spiritual exercise to keep off social media for a whole day. That's an extra bonus for this exercise. But the main point of it is so that you only really become aware of yourself, that you're not really gaining false relevance or significance in the world. Because after all, what is the relevance of that? We keep ourselves informed, watch the news, we're aware of everything all the time. And for the most part, all that does is make us suffer more. All that does is make us unhappy or anxious or frustrated or angry about things which are almost entirely right outside of our control, actually out of our purvey, nothing to do with us. They affect us, certainly. But if we have absolutely no power to engage with it, it's worth thinking, why do I actually pay so much attention to that? Do I feel it's important or significant by doing that? You can even try and put yourself into some hard work. Firstly, you got to do some household chores, even if you don't normally do some household chores. If you do, the exercise is in being present, doing it as if for the first time, feeling as if it's the only important thing to do. Right from that breakfast and that brushing of the teeth to the rest of the chores, this is the only important thing to do. And do some tough chores that challenge your ego. Clean the toilet. See how your ego deals with that. Observe yourself doing that. It's a great choice in reducing humility. When it comes to dealing with other people, try speak only when spoken to. Don't volunteer conversation. Receive, listen. Try not speak back unless something you say is not about yourself and is definitely true. That's a great exercise. The definitely true is to prevent you saying most things. Even I'm fine when you're not. Rather say nothing. Don't say I'm not fine, because that might be attracting sympathy. Rather just smile and say it's a nice day. And that's true. And that's not attracting attention to the ego. I'm having a nice day. You know, ways to try not, that is about yourself, but try not make it that you are the special one. It's really the day. So keeping quiet where possible, speaking only when spoken to, speaking only the truth, being deliberately humble, even when they're wrong and you're right, saying nothing. and try and find people in, like for example, homeless people or vagrants that you encounter or beggars that you encounter, and apply the same set of rules. This person is older than me. I will treat them with humility. This person is another human being, even if they're not older than me. I will be humble and assume that their ego is just as important as mine, that their sense of themselves is just as important as mine. All just examples of finding where your ego will try and step into the picture in order to increase your sense of identity. And again, to remind you, isn't that there's anything wrong with identity itself. It's just attached to our identity can prevent us from making spiritual progress. Now, as you work on these exercises during the day, observe yourself. Watch how your ego reacts. We get angry or upset. I don't clean toilets. I mean, I'll do anything, but I won't clean toilets. Any reaction whatsoever is a reaction from the ego. And if you're feeling angry, you might be feeling angry at me because I was the one who sent you to go and clean the loo. But if you're feeling angry, realize it's that ego trying to defend itself. The trap that you can easily fall into when listening to this, when watching me, is to say, yes, I understand that. Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I don't really need to clean toilets. I do get what you're saying. If that was in your head, I have just bust you. You do have to still get on with the chores. That's all of us. It's more than appreciating the principles. The ego has a lot of mechanisms to defend itself, and one of those is that one, rationalization. The ego will continuously use rationalization and clever, well thought out excuses to convince you not to do things. It does that with plenty of other things that are not about exercises in humility, but they're all things you don't want to do. And think about whenever you're faced with something you don't want to do, how we will use rationalization. It is the ego rebelling, and the task of the day is the step one of breaking down the ego is to engage in present tense humility, to deliberately act like the ego is not there. The ego is so accustomed to using untruths to protect its sense of integrity. I mean, think of this little example. You nod off during a movie or while watching TV, and your partner says to you, hey, you were sleeping. No, I wasn't. No, I just briefly closed my eyes. We so strongly deny falling asleep there because it makes us feel embarrassed. Embarrassment is the ego's greatest fear and perhaps enemy. And so notice the things that make you feel embarrassed and take them on board. Don't defend yourself. Laugh and say, yes, that was me. And realize it's funny. One of the things about trainees, sangomas, and anyone training on a spiritual path is that it's often seen as the jester path, where you need to learn to laugh at yourself and laugh at the world. As we teach our training sangomas, without being able to do that, we won't make any progress either. It's going to be a long day when you do that, and you might be delighted that it's over, when it's finally over, and you've made your own bed to get into. But the next day you need a little bit of debriefing. So you might find the next day you rush for all the comforts, you rush for all the indulgences that I denied you the day before. And again, watch yourself, because that means maybe you didn't really take it on. I mean, certainly you now appreciate it. But remember that people on a spiritual path don't have it tomorrow when they can do that. They carry on living in humility for years. And so your real task the next day is to try and take on some of what you learnt on Humility Day and bring it more into your rest of your everyday life. One of the things we're going to try and achieve on our spiritual path is to so step away from that ego that it doesn't even feel like it's ourselves. And so noticing your ego as if you're a second person noticing it is also part of that exercise that will be very beneficial to you. So during that next day, notice also your negative feelings that came up. Notice the anger at all the things that I made you do, or that you had to do, or that you hated doing. And in noticing your anger, try and feel compassion towards that ego. Keep that sense of distance from it, by keeping a sense of compassion and realizing it's like a frustrated child who doesn't know any better. So I'm not going to judge myself. I'm not going to say my ego is a bad thing. I will simply realize that my ego doesn't know any better. And so in order to help that ego of yours, try and approach everything you're doing on the next day, which doesn't have to be the humility things, with a new sense of appreciation. The foods, the luxury, the hot water in the bath, all of those things with an appreciation of the ego takes things for granted. I take things for granted. There's so much going on in this exercise. It looks quite straightforward, but you're learning many things. You're learning about ego. You're learning about breaking down the ego. You're learning about observing yourself as if from the outside. When your attention is brought back then to the news, to the social media, to the newspaper or the radio or the TV, when watching those things, ask yourself, how do I know that that's true? What is the source of that information? Why do I believe it? And most important of all, what does that have to do with me? Why is it necessary for me to know that? Does it benefit me by knowing that? Does it increase my stress or unhappiness by knowing that? And with those ones that make us feel better, is it true? Because the ego is easily pandered to. It's easily fooled. So we hopefully will learn from that exercise to take in less of the trivial stuff going on around and hopefully start getting a sense of what is really true. The other thing, of course, is that it wasn't easy to do a day of humility. You felt like you were suffering and you were relieved to be done with it the next day. And we know that suffering is itself part of the spiritual journey. And we're going to talk about that extensively in the episode in January. At that time, we're also going to look at discipline. So next time, join me for a discussion on suffering and discipline and how to use those to grow your spiritual practice. In the meanwhile, you've got some work to do in diminishing that ego. We have time for 2 quick questions this week. The first one from Simone. Considering that some important ANC and EFF and members of society say that it's possible that after some further changes the ANC and EFF might unite and elect Julius Malema as president. The question is, will Julius Malema be our next president? And the answer is no, I certainly don't think so. I don't know about the longer term future. That's a completely different matter. But in the reasonable future, just the next few years leading up to our next election, it doesn't look like there's significant enough change in the EFF and in Malema's own chart for that to be true. The ANC is experiencing a lot of change as it begins to break down and even maybe split. But that is not yet the result. So for the foreseeable future, Mr. Malema is not our next president. I also have a question from Lisa. Lisa, you say you've had an opportunity to travel for a year around Africa next year. Should you do that and unsettle the peace and harmony you finally have been able to establish here at home? Or is it time to actually work on developing that home? Well, Lisa, I will tell you this, that the chart does show that in terms of home and peace and harmony, that is beginning to increase, and many of the challenges of the last year or two are settling down, and some more harmonious times are ahead. But starting from May next year, it really does look like a great time to be traveling around. In truth, the answer to your question is 2017 and 18 are excellent times to be traveling around. I would actually choose a year starting from May, but that might be splitting hairs and might not be consistent with the opportunity that's there for you. So given that, the answer is yes, this is a great time to be traveling for a year, but if you don't, you will still be able to build on the peace and harmony that you've established at home this year, because it is looking better for that. Remember, if you have a question, whether it's a general question like Simone's or a personal question like Lisa's, drop me a line at this address. For personal questions, remember to include your date, place, and time of birth. And I will be back next week, where we also have an interview with an initiate into an altogether different tradition that will also help us understand some of the challenges we face. So don't miss that next week. See you then.